The Minnesota Wild, a team so utterly forgettable that I actually forgot to do this video for them. Really, I was going through my list of all the teams in order in terms of how they finished, and I just completely missed the Wild like 5 or 6 times. But we're here now, so I guess let's get this over with. Are the Minnesota Wild going to do anything memorable in 2024-25?
I admit it. Last year was rough.
Following a playoff appearance in 2022-23, the Wild came into the 23-24 season with expectations of taking the next step forward. That next step was apparently into an open chasm because the Wild started last year on a horrific 5-10-14 run to start the season that included a 7-game losing streak that ended up in head coach Dean Avison getting canned. Probably a coach getting fired has a bit of a placebo effect, and the Wild responded to Avison's departure by winning 11 out of their next 14. It looked like that had done the trick, and then they proceeded to lose 8 of their next 9. Unfortunately, that second stretch is what killed them. After a fantastic run to claw their way out of that hole, the Wild were basically out of the playoff picture by January. They kept fighting throughout the course of the season, ending up 6 games over 500 for the year, but those 2 terrible stretches in the first 3 months of the season, combined with the fact that the Wild were just unable to play any sort of defense during that stretch, is ultimately what doomed them in, leading to them being one of the surprise teams to miss the playoffs in 2024. Dean Avison is gone, and rightfully so. He was absolutely terrible, most notably due to the decline of the Wild's defensive structure at the end of his tenure, and his lack of ability to get his offensive stars, guys like Kaprizov and Boldy, going early on in the season. He was replaced midseason by John Hynes, kind of a life raft of a hire. I assumed in the offseason Bill Guerin would go out, do his due diligence, and hire an actual competent coach. This is why you don't assume things, ladies and gentlemen. Hynes was given the big job. He is now the head coach of the Minnesota Wild. If you want to fully appreciate how bad of a hire that is, let's just ask New Jersey Devils fans what their feelings are on this decision.
Now comes the part where we throw our heads back and laugh. Ready? Ready!
It's honestly really hard to find a justification as to why Bill Guerin hired John Hynes as a head coach other than they're buddies, and they had some success at the AHL level together, but I have a feeling they're going to have plenty of time to get drinks together when they're both on the unemployment line in about a year.
You're a star! You're on top! Somebody bring you some ham!
You should kill yourself!
Kirill the Thrill Kaprizov is one of the most electrifying and incredibly talented players in the NHL right now. You've never heard of him because he plays for the fucking Minnesota Wild. Last year, despite a slow start, Kaprizov still put up 46 goals and 96 points on the year. The dude's such an absolute gamer, and when he has the puck on his stick, he's better than almost anybody I've seen in the NHL. But his individual success only stands in sharp contrast to the lack of team success, and therein lies the rub. With only 2 years left on his current deal, there are rumblings that Kaprizov could be interested in a move out of Minnesota, potentially to a place like Chicago. What's shocking to me is that since he's gone pro, Kaprizov has only missed the playoffs once in his career, and that was last year with the Wild. If they want to have a prayer of keeping this guy in Minnesota long term, they need to show him that they're committed to winning, and that's not just making the playoffs this year, that's going on a pretty deep run, either this year or next. With John Hynes as your head coach, good luck with that.
Oh, this guy again.
And also good luck with that, considering Kaprizov's center on the first line is Ryan Hartman, a guy whose career year was 65 points, is not exactly the guy you want anchoring a line with your franchise's best player. So for the Wild's sake, I hope you make a big move in season to add somebody who can get Kaprizov going to the level that he deserves to be. At least there's a competent foil on the opposite wing in Matt Zuccarello. But now at age 37, you have to wonder how much gas he has left in the tank and how many 60-70 point seasons he has left in him. Again, if you want to keep Kaprizov around, you need to show that he can put him with players who are going to help elevate him, not guys that he has to drag and elevate himself. Their second line will be centered by Joel Eriksson Ek, who's a good player, but he's also one of those guys who's now so underrated, he's kind of becoming overrated, if that makes sense. He's a really good player, but can we stop acting like a guy who's in the prime of his career and has never hit 65 points in a season as a playmaking center is like a bona fide star in this league? He's a good defensive forward, I will grant, but you do have to wonder among these forwards, where are you getting that offensive production from, if not Kaprizov? Is that coming from his other line mate, Marcus Johansson, a guy who I love, but if he hits 20 goals and 40 points, that is a considerable surprise at this point in his career. Really, their only other hope in the top 6 offensively is Matt Boldy, their other wing on the second line, who's coming off back-to-back 60-point seasons and was 1 goal shy last season of back-to-back 30-goal years. At only age 23, there's still a lot of room for him to grow and continue to elevate his offensive game because he's already a very solid all-around player. Third line center Marco Rossi is kind of in that same boat as Boldy. He's a year older, but only has 1 full year of NHL experience, and while that was not quite as productive as Boldy has been in his career, there should still be hope in Minnesota that his offensive productivity will continue to improve. But for now, he's still very much a two-way player on a team that has a glut of those. Just look at his line mate Marcus Foligno. Now kind of towards the tail end of his prime, he's much more of a defensive player and leader. His 30-40 point seasons are probably more the exception than the rule at this point of his career. They rounded out that third line with one of their few signings this offseason, Jakub Trenin. Young Liam Ogren is going to get his first look in the NHL on the fourth line. He projects to be more of an offensive player, but he'll be able to use his big size on the fourth line effectively. While Russian center Mirek Kuznetsov is now here with one of the most unintentionally funny names in the entire NHL. Not as big a body, so it's surprising to see projections have him on the fourth line to start. Maybe he'll end up getting swapped up into the top 9 with a guy like Marcus Foligno or something. And finally, rounding out that fourth line is Freddie Gaudreau, a guy that a lot of people in the room seem to like, but who hasn't done anything of note in his many chances to crack the NHL. On the back end, veteran Jonas Brodin will anchor the first pairing. He's one of those guys who doesn't really pop on the stat sheet, but he does a lot of little things, very solid at all times. In my mind, though, he'd be much better suited as an elite second pairing guy than a kind of mediocre to below average first pairing player. But he'll be paired with Brock Faber, one of my favorite young defensemen in the NHL, and a guy who, like a lot of other young players, was due for an extension this offseason. And after seeing all those young forwards who haven't produced much get paid obscene amounts of money, you might be expecting me to rant and rail at the fact that Faber got an 8x8, but honestly, I'm not going to. Faber's production has justified that contract. That's going to, in my opinion, age into one of the better value deals in the entire NHL. Faber's already an above average to very good first pairing defenseman, and he got appropriately paid as such. The second pairing, Jake Middleton and Jared Spurgeon, is one of those incredibly well-balanced duos. Spurgeon's the smaller puck-moving defenseman, while Middleton is the big, strong, stay-at-home type, and as a result, I have them as one of the better second pairings in the entire NHL. Unfortunately, the exact opposite is true when it comes to their bottom pairing defensemen. While yes, Declan Chisholm and Zach Bogosian have the same archetype puck mover and stay-at-home guy as the second pair, Chisholm just hasn't shown enough productivity for a relatively advanced prospect at age 24, and Zach Bogosian is just not reliable enough defensively or even in terms of staying healthy that it's going to outweigh an offensive guy like Chisholm. It's just a pair of flawed guys who stylistically complement each other, but in terms of their actual play and abilities, might bring out the worst in each other. In goal, the Gus Bus will again be relied on to be the #1 goaltender. I said last year I was a bit wary of Philip Gustafsson given his up and down propensity, and last year was a down year, an .899 save percentage and a GAA above 3 with a negative goal saved above expected per 60. His backup is somehow even worse. The fossil known as Marc-Andre Fleury is here for one more ride trying to get a Stanley Cup, or at least that's what he claims. It's hard to take the claim you're going for one last Stanley Cup seriously when you sign with the fucking Minnesota Wild. But hey, ever since leaving Pittsburgh, he's won more playoff series than Sidney Crosby has. Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
Oh, Brit is in this?
It's hard to add in the offseason when you're still sitting on $15 million worth of buyout penalties. Thanks again for that, Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. But at least this is the last year that you're going to be anchored with that $15 million. It drops to $500,000 each next year. With such limited cap space, the Wild had to be strategic and smart with who they went out and got in the offseason. They were not. They signed Jakub Trenin to a 4-year, $14 million contract for a guy who's an overall defensive liability and has never cracked 30 points in a season. Seriously, Wild, are you ever going to get out of your own way?
That's not bad.
Kirill Kaprizov is a top 5 wing and a top 10 forward in the NHL, and it burns me that the Wild are just sitting on their asses doing nothing to try and build around this guy. Like, it is egregious the amount of talent that they're putting along with him on the forward core, and in net particularly. Their defense, really good, I'll grant you that, and I understand that they are limited by the ghosts of those Parise and Suter signings, but my god, you guys have got to make some moves if you want to convince Kaprizov to stay here long term. I'm being dead serious when I say this, Wild fans. He's a free agent this offseason. Move the money around and go get Mitch Marner. He's the exact type of guy you want playing alongside Kaprizov. That would show that you're serious about building around him.
The Gambletron 2000 says the winner is Cincinnati by 200 points. Why, you worthless hunk of junk?
I have the Wild as my last team out in the West. I think they're going to barely miss making the playoffs yet again. So their ceiling, in my opinion, is probably a wildcard spot or that 3rd seed in the division. That forward core is just so shaky, in my opinion. They cannot afford to take an injury to one of their big guys like Kaprizov, Boldy, or Eriksson Ek. If one of those guys goes down, the Wild are so incredibly fucked.
A team that consistently wastes great talent every year. Even as a Hawks fan, I genuinely feel bad for them.
The Wild are like a second Toronto Maple Leafs. When did they make the second round? 2014? Every year, this team is a free win for any team that faces them in the first round of the playoffs.
Minnesota would be a better name. I want to like them, I do. But the stupid management and terrible contracts that management sign over and over make it impossible. Get Kaprizov out of there.
LMAO, when you're so mid, you get your season roast mixed in with the playoff teams. You know you're mid AF.